Hello and welcome to the next lecture for U.S. history. Today, we'll explore a defining moment in the nation's past, the Civil War. There are two primary sets of issues to be addressed in this lecture. First, the opposing sides of the North and South will be compared and contrasted. Secondly, the presentation will investigate some of the major battles, as well as life for soldiers fighting in the war. The image here shows Confederate dead following the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day of the war. We will begin by addressing the situation faced by Abraham Lincoln as he entered the presidency in March of 1861. Abraham Lincoln inherited the most difficult political situation any American president had ever faced. Before he took the oath of office, 7 states had seceded from the Union. His critics were numerous and didn't believe he had the resolve to address the situation. This map identifies the states in the Deep South which had already seceded from the Union. They had rejected the United States Constitution and formed the Confederate States of America. Lincoln was morally opposed to slavery, yet he declared in his inaugural address, as he had many times before, he would not interfere with slavery in states where it was already legal. Instead, he would not allow its expansion into new territories. He also affirmed he would maintain American sovereignty over all U.S. territory in the states which had left the Union. This assertion was bound to lead to conflict. Conflict was indeed seen with the federal fort located in Fort Sumter, South Carolina, which was desperately short of food and supplies. Lincoln wanted to resupply the garrison without provoking war. Demonstrating his political skill, he notified the South Carolina governor he was sending unarmed ships with food and other provisions to the fort. Before the supply ship could reach the fort, Confederate batteries bombed the fort in the early morning of April 12th. The American commander surrendered the next day. No one was killed in this attack, but the fighting in the war had begun. Lincoln requested 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion in the Lower South. In response, 4 additional states of the Upper South voted in favor of secession. Here we see the map of secession once again. The states identified in yellow show the states of the Upper South, which waited until Lincoln's call for volunteers to secede from the Union. The debate over secession was quite controversial. Many Virginians were opposed. Representatives from western counties in the state held their own convention, elected their own governor, and applied to be admitted into the Union. The image here, showing supporters of the Union in Tennessee, reflects the debate in this state, which eventually joined the Confederacy. Once these states left the Union, they formed their own government with their own constitution. The Confederate Constitution emphasized states' rights and the protection of slavery in any new territories acquired. They also elected their own leaders. Jefferson Davis, a former senator and Secretary of War, was elected President of the Confederate States of America. Richmond eventually was named the capital of the Confederacy. The Civil War was not simply a war addressing the issue of slavery. This is clearly seen with the actions of the border states. Border states refer to slave states which remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War. Eventually, there were 5 border states: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and then West Virginia. The border states are shown in blue here. Maintaining the loyalty of these states was crucial to the war aims of the Union. Maryland was particularly important as it bordered on Washington, D.C. You can also see on this map that West Virginia broke away from Eastern Virginia and was admitted to the Union as its own state in 1863. Lincoln took bold actions to address the situation with the border states. Shortly after a confrontation between Northern troops and citizens in Baltimore, Lincoln declared the area should be occupied and he suspended the writ of habeas corpus. This allowed officials to arrest Confederates and Confederate sympathizers and hold them in jail indefinitely without official charges. When exploring the opposing sides on the eve of the war, it was clear that each had its own advantages and disadvantages. The northern states had the advantage of size and population. There were 23 states which remained in the Union during the war, with a combined population of about 22 million. The Confederacy included 11 states, with a population of only 9 million. Of those 9 million, about 5.5 million were white, while 3.5 million were enslaved. Not only did the North, as shown in light blue with this chart, have more population, it also had a much larger population of free white males ages 18 to 20 who would be responsible for much of the fighting in the war. Another advantage for the North was seen with its potential for industrial production. The North included about 90% of the nation's industrial capacity and over 2/3 of its railroad mileage, whereas the South had very little industrial capacity and fewer miles of railroads. As we look more closely at this chart, we see some specifics with industrial production. Look at the figures for producing firearms. The North included 97% of the nation's potential capacity for producing firearms at the beginning of the war. Production of both iron and coal would also prove to be important. Finally, most acknowledge that the South's economy was based primarily on agriculture. However, their number one crop was cotton. You couldn't eat cotton. The North had 75% of the nation's farms, including most of the livestock, wheat, and corn production. Here, we see the figures for farm production broken down. The only area where you see the South outpacing the North is with the production of cotton. Here they faced a decided advantage. Overall, as shown here, the North produced about 75% of the nation's wealth. One initial Union strategy was developed by General Winfield Scott. Critics labeled this the Anaconda Plan. It called for Union blockades of southern ports and a major attack down the Mississippi River, which could then cut the Confederacy in two. Lincoln did attempt to establish a blockade, but did not have the manpower to seize and control the Mississippi in 1861. While at first glance it was clear the Union had many advantages, the Confederates had their own advantages as well. One major advantage for Southerners was home court advantage. This was not only important because they knew the climate and terrain, but they could also fight a largely defensive war, forcing the North to travel and maintain long lines of supply. A second advantage involved their war aims. They had a concrete goal in this war. They were fighting to maintain their own way of life. If you remember this slide from Lecture 13, it shows the structure of Southern society. They wanted to maintain the status quo, the life they'd grown up with. As far as whites were concerned, as long as slavery existed, they weren't on the bottom of society. Northern war aims were more abstract. They fought to preserve the Union. It wasn't until the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1862 that the Union war aims became more concrete. Another Southern advantage dealt with their officers. Some of the best officers in the U.S. Army resigned their commissions and enlisted in the Confederacy at the beginning of the war. One final Southern advantage was described as King Cotton. Tremendous amounts of cotton was shipped to European nations in the years before the Civil War. British textile mills received 75% of their raw cotton from the American South. The economic ties between the South and Europe were quite strong. If you remember this slide, also from Lecture 13, it reflects the tremendous levels of cotton exported, primarily to European markets.